At 11:42 on the night of December 19, 1944, First Lieutenant Ruth Mitchell stood in the receiving tent of the 67th Evacuation Hospital near Bastogne, Belgium, watching American soldiers die faster than she could count them. They were arriving on stretchers in groups of 10 and 12, carried by medics who'd driven through German artillery fire to get them there, wounded from the sudden massive German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Blood soaked through their uniforms, pooled on the canvas stretchers, dripped onto the frozen ground of the tent floor. Most were unconscious from shock and blood loss, their faces gray-white in the lamplight, their pulses weak and rapid, their breathing shallow. They needed blood transfusions immediately or they would die within the hour, but the standard Army protocol for blood transfusions required 40 minutes of preparation per patient, and Ruth Mitchell was looking at 87 men who didn't have 40 minutes. The triage officer, Captain William Morrison, was making the calculations that no doctor should ever have to make, deciding which men might survive long enough for typed and cross-matched blood transfusions and which men were too far gone to save. He pointed at soldiers and called out designations: immediate surgery, delayed surgery, expectant. The last category was medical terminology for men who would die before resources could be allocated to treat them. 17 men in the expectant category that night, 17 American soldiers laid on stretchers along the side wall of the tent, covered with blankets, given morphine for pain, and left to die because saving them would require blood transfusions that couldn't be prepared fast enough. Ruth Mitchell had been an Army nurse for 19 months, had served in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy before transferring to the European theater in November, had seen hundreds of wounded soldiers, had watched men die from wounds and infections and shock. But she had never watched men die simply because the medical protocols were too slow to save them. She walked over to Captain Morrison and asked him a question that would change military medicine forever. What if we didn't type and cross-match the blood? What if we just gave them type O negative without testing? Would that work? Morrison looked at her like she'd suggested setting the wounded on fire. Lieutenant Mitchell, untyped blood transfusions violate every protocol in the Army Medical Corps manual. If the blood types are incompatible, the patient dies from transfusion reaction, you'd be killing them yourself. But they're dying anyway, Ruth said. All 17 of those men in expectant are going to be dead by morning. What if there's a chance that O-negative blood could save them? Morrison shook his head. There's a Navy doctor, a researcher, who's written some papers about universal donor theory, the idea that type O-negative blood might be safely given to anyone regardless of blood type, but it's theoretical, it's never been tested on a large scale, and if you're wrong, you'll kill every patient you transfuse. Ruth looked at the 17 men along the wall, looked at the medics still carrying in more wounded, looked at Morrison and said something that would define the rest of her life. Then let me be wrong, because doing nothing is killing them for certain. If this story pulls you in, just tap like and subscribe. Now let's go back and understand how Ruth Mitchell got to that tent in Belgium and why she was willing to risk everything on a theory that nobody had proven. Ruth Elizabeth Mitchell was born on April 3, 1918, in Bloomington, Indiana, the daughter of a pharmacist who believed his children should understand science and a mother who taught elementary school and believed his children should understand compassion. Ruth grew up in a house where dinner conversations involved chemistry and biology, where her father explained how medications worked at a molecular level, where science was treated as a tool for helping people rather than abstract theory. She attended Indiana University starting in 1936, intending to study pharmacy like her father, but switched to nursing after spending one semester volunteering at the university hospital and realizing that direct patient care mattered more to her than compounding prescriptions. She graduated from the Indiana University School of Nursing in May 1940 with honors and went to work at Indianapolis City Hospital, where she spent 3 years learning practical nursing in the emergency department, the surgical ward, and the intensive care unit. She saw gunshot wounds and automobile accidents and industrial injuries and learned that medicine was often a race against time, that the difference between a patient living or dying frequently came down to minutes, that protocols existed to ensure safety but sometimes protocols were too slow for the reality of emergency medicine. In December 1942, 6 months after the United States entered World War II, Ruth enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps because she believed that if young men were going overseas to fight, someone needed to go overseas to save the ones who got wounded. She went through basic training at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, where the Army taught nurses how to work in field conditions, how to set up mobile hospitals, how to perform triage under fire, how to treat wounds they'd never see in civilian hospitals. She learned that battlefield medicine was different from hospital medicine, that resources were limited, that decisions had to be made quickly, that sometimes you couldn't save everyone and had to choose who received treatment first. She deployed to North Africa in March 1943 with the 67th Evacuation Hospital, a mobile medical unit that followed behind advancing armies and provided surgical care for wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated to rear-area hospitals. The 67th moved through North Africa as Allied forces pushed German and Italian armies eastward, then moved to Sicily for the invasion in July 1943, then to Italy for the campaign up the peninsula starting in September. Ruth spent 18 months working in surgical tents, in bombed-out buildings converted to hospitals, in any space that could hold operating tables and wounded men. She learned to work in the dark with only flashlights because electric lights would draw enemy bombers, learned to work during artillery barrages when the ground shook and supplies fell off tables, learned to work with whatever medical supplies were available because supply lines were unpredictable and running out of plasma or morphine or bandages was a constant reality. She also learned about blood transfusions, about the critical importance of replacing lost blood in wounded soldiers, about how blood loss killed more soldiers than the wounds themselves. Human blood has different types, designated A, B, AB, and O with positive or negative Rh factors, and transfusing the wrong blood type into a patient causes a transfusion reaction where the immune system attacks the foreign blood cells, leading to kidney failure, shock, and death. That's why Army protocol required blood typing and cross-matching before transfusions, a laboratory process where a sample of the patient's blood was mixed with a sample of the donor blood to verify compatibility. The process took between 30 and 45 minutes depending on laboratory conditions and technician experience. For stable patients, 40 minutes wasn't a problem, but for soldiers bleeding out from arterial wounds or internal injuries, 40 minutes meant death. Ruth watched men die waiting for typed blood, watched medics and doctors perform the blood tests as fast as possible while patients' blood pressure dropped and their hearts stopped, watched the terrible mathematics of battlefield medicine where following proper procedure meant some patients couldn't be saved. She had read about the universal donor theory in a nursing journal, an article by a Navy medical researcher named Lieutenant Commander John Ashford who had studied blood transfusion reactions and proposed that type O negative blood, which lacked the antigens that triggered immune reactions, could theoretically be given to any patient regardless of blood type. The theory made biological sense. O negative blood had no A antigens, no B antigens, and no Rh factor, so there was nothing for a recipient's immune system to react against. It was universal in the sense that any blood type could theoretically accept it without triggering transfusion reactions. But theoretical and proven were different things. The theory was based on laboratory testing and small-scale clinical observations. It hadn't been tested in large-scale battlefield conditions, and the Army Medical Corps hadn't approved untyped transfusions because the risk of being wrong, the risk of killing patients with incompatible blood, was too high. Ruth understood the caution, understood why protocols existed, understood that medical regulations were written to protect patients from harm. But she also understood that sometimes caution killed people, that sometimes following procedure meant watching patients die who might have been saved, that sometimes the greater risk was doing nothing. In November 1944, Ruth and the 67th Evacuation Hospital transferred from Italy to France and then to Belgium to support the Allied armies advancing toward Germany. By December, they were positioned near Bastogne, a Belgian town that controlled critical road junctions in the Ardennes forest region. The war seemed to be winding down. German forces were retreating on all fronts. Allied commanders were planning for final offensives into Germany that would end the war by spring. Then, on December 16, 1944, everything changed. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16, German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest aimed at splitting Allied armies and capturing the port of Antwerp. 29 German divisions, over 400,000 men supported by tanks and artillery, attacked through a lightly defended sector of the American line that intelligence had considered too difficult for large-scale operations. The German attack achieved complete surprise. American units were overrun, defensive lines collapsed, and within hours the entire Allied front in the Ardennes was in chaos. The 67th Evacuation Hospital, positioned 15 miles behind what had been a stable front line, suddenly found itself nearly surrounded as German armored units pushed through American defenses. On December 17th, the hospital received orders to evacuate westward, but before they could move, wounded American soldiers began arriving in overwhelming numbers. Men from units that had been shattered in the initial German attack, men who had fought for 2 days without rest trying to slow the German advance, men with wounds from artillery, from machine guns, from tank fire, from everything the Wehrmacht could throw at them. The hospital couldn't evacuate while wounded were arriving, couldn't abandon American soldiers who needed immediate medical care, so the decision was made to stay and operate until the situation stabilized. For 3 days, the 67th worked around the clock performing surgeries, treating wounded, and sending recovered patients westward in ambulances while new casualties continued to arrive. Ruth worked 18-hour shifts in the surgical tent, assisting doctors with operations, managing post-operative care, coordinating with medics who brought in the wounded. She watched the supplies dwindle, watched the plasma reserves drop, watched the blood supplies that were supposed to last 2 weeks get consumed in 3 days. By December 19th, the situation was critical. The hospital had received over 600 wounded soldiers in 72 hours, far exceeding its design capacity of 100 patients. Supplies were running dangerously low, and the German advance had cut several supply routes, making resupply uncertain. That evening, a convoy of ambulances arrived with 87 more casualties from the 101st Airborne Division, which was surrounded in Bastogne and fighting desperately to hold the town against German attacks. These soldiers had been wounded that morning, had waited hours for evacuation through German artillery fire, and had finally been loaded onto ambulances that made a dangerous run through contested territory to reach the hospital. Most were suffering from severe blood loss, shrapnel wounds that had severed arteries, bullet wounds that had punctured major blood vessels, blast injuries that caused massive internal bleeding. They needed blood transfusions immediately, but the hospital's blood supply was nearly exhausted. Ruth and the other nurses inventoried what remained: 42 units of typed whole blood, various types, and 83 units of type O negative blood that had been designated for emergency use. Under normal protocol, each patient would be blood typed, matched with compatible donor blood, cross-matched to verify compatibility, then transfused. The process took 40 minutes per patient and required laboratory testing for each transfusion. Captain Morrison, the chief medical officer, ran the numbers and delivered the devastating assessment. We can save 63 of these men with the blood we have and the time we have. The other 24 will die waiting. Ruth looked at the men on stretchers, looked at the soldiers who would be designated expectant and left to die, and something inside her refused to accept it. She asked Morrison about the universal donor theory, asked if giving O-negative blood without typing might work, asked if saving 24 more men was worth the risk of being wrong. Morrison's answer was clear: the theory was unproven, the risk was too high, and violating blood transfusion protocols could kill patients and would certainly end her career. But Ruth had made her decision. She would rather be court-martialed for trying to save lives than follow protocols that guaranteed men would die. She waited until Morrison left to begin surgical operations, then gathered 3 nurses she trusted, explained what she wanted to do, and asked if they would help her. All 3 agreed immediately. They had watched too many men die, had felt the same frustration with protocols that were too slow, had the same willingness to risk their careers if it meant saving lives. At 11:42 on the night of December 19, 1944, Ruth Mitchell began the unauthorized medical experiment that would either save 24 men or kill them. Ruth and her 3 nurses, Lieutenant Sarah Peterson from Minnesota, Lieutenant Mary Chun from California, and Lieutenant Dorothy Williams from Georgia, moved quietly through the ward where the expectant category patients lay on stretchers. These were the men Morrison had determined couldn't be saved, the ones too critically wounded to survive the 40-minute blood typing process, the ones who would die within hours from blood loss and shock. 17 men total, all unconscious or barely conscious, all with blood pressure so low that their pulses were barely palpable, all dying while the medical staff focused resources on patients who had better chances of survival. Ruth had made her selection carefully, She would use the 83 units of type O negative blood to transfuse these 17 men plus 7 others from the delayed surgery category who were stable but deteriorating. 24 patients total, 24 unauthorized transfusions, 24 chances to prove that universal donor theory worked, or 24 deaths that would be directly attributable to her decision. The nurses worked in pairs. One nurse would start an intravenous line and hang the blood bag while the other monitored vital signs and watched for any indication of transfusion reaction. They started with the most critical patients first, the men who had minutes rather than hours, the ones who would definitely die without immediate intervention. Ruth took the first transfusion herself, selected a 19-year-old private from Ohio named Thomas Bradley who had a shrapnel wound in his abdomen and had lost massive amounts of blood. His blood pressure was 60/40, his pulse was 130, his skin was cold and gray. She started the 4-line, hung a unit of O-negative blood, opened the flow control, and watched the blood begin flowing into Bradley's veins. Then she waited for the transfusion reaction that would tell her she'd made a fatal mistake. Transfusion reactions happen quickly, usually within the first 15 minutes. The patient develops fever, chills, back pain, difficulty breathing, then rapid deterioration into shock and kidney failure. Ruth watched Bradley's vital signs, monitored his temperature, checked his breathing, looked for any sign that his body was rejecting the foreign blood. 5 minutes passed, no reaction. 10 minutes, still stable. 15 minutes, and Bradley's blood pressure had increased to 70/50. The transfusion was working, his body was accepting the O-negative blood, his circulation was improving, he was surviving. Ruth moved to the second patient while Peterson stayed with Bradley to monitor his continued response. The second patient was a 23-year-old sergeant from Texas named Robert Hayes with multiple bullet wounds and catastrophic blood loss. Same procedure, 4-line, O-negative blood, watch and wait. Hayes showed the same response, no transfusion reaction, improving vital signs, stable condition. By midnight, Ruth and her nurses had transfused 8 patients. By 1 in the morning they'd completed 16. By 2 in the morning all 24 unauthorized transfusions were complete. Not a single transfusion reaction, not one patient showing signs of immune response, every transfusion working exactly as universal donor theory predicted. The patients were stabilizing, their blood pressure was improving, their color was returning, they were surviving injuries that should have killed them. Ruth sat down on a supply crate at 2:15 in the morning and allowed herself to feel the enormity of what had just happened. She had violated direct orders, had performed unauthorized medical procedures, had risked killing 24 men, and had saved all of them. But the night wasn't over. Transfusion reactions could occur hours after initial transfusion. Kidney failure could develop over days. She wouldn't know for certain that the universal donor protocol worked until all 24 patients remained stable for at least 48 hours. At 6 in the morning on December 20th, Captain Morrison arrived for morning rounds and immediately noticed that patients who should have died were alive and improving. He checked the medical charts, saw the O-negative blood transfusions recorded without blood typing or cross-matching, saw Ruth's initials on every chart, and understood instantly what she had done. Morrison pulled Ruth aside into an empty office and closed the door. His face was a mixture of anger and shock and something else, something that might have been respect. "Lieutenant Mitchell, did you perform untyped blood transfusions on 24 patients without authorization?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir," Ruth replied. "They were dying and we had O-negative blood and I believed universal donor theory would work." "You believed," Morrison repeated. "You bet 24 lives on a theory. Do you understand that if even one of those patients dies from transfusion reaction, you'll face court-martial for medical malpractice?" "I understand, sir, but if I'd done nothing, all 24 would have died for certain. This way they had a chance." Morrison looked at her for a long moment, then said something Ruth never forgot. "You're either the bravest nurse I've ever met or the most reckless. We'll know which when we see if those patients survive." For the next 48 hours, Ruth and her nurses monitored the 24 transfusion patients obsessively, checking vital signs every hour, watching for delayed transfusion reactions, documenting every detail of their recovery. Private Thomas Bradley, the first patient Ruth had transfused, regained consciousness on December 20th and asked for water. By December 21st he was sitting up and eating solid food. by December 22 he was asking when he could return to his unit. Sergeant Robert Hayes followed a similar trajectory, stable after 24 hours, improving after 48, fully conscious and recovering after 72. All 24 patients survived. Not one developed a transfusion reaction, not one showed signs of kidney failure or immune response. All 24 accepted the O-negative blood as if it had been typed and cross-matched specifically for them. The universal donor theory wasn't theoretical anymore, it was proven, validated by 24 real patients in battlefield conditions, demonstrated to work exactly as the Navy researcher had predicted. Captain Morrison documented everything in detailed medical reports, the circumstances of the unauthorized transfusions, the patient's responses, the lack of complications, the successful outcomes. He sent the reports up the chain of command to the Theater Medical Command with a cover letter that said Lieutenant Mitchell had violated protocols but had also potentially discovered a way to save thousands of lives in battlefield conditions. On December 23, a medical officer from theater headquarters arrived at the 67th to investigate. Colonel Richard Patterson, a career Army doctor who had served in World War I and understood both military regulations and battlefield reality. Patterson interviewed Ruth, reviewed the medical charts, examined the patients, and asked the question that would determine whether Ruth faced court-martial or commendation. Lieutenant Mitchell, why did you believe unauthorized transfusions were justified when established protocols existed specifically to prevent the kind of risk you took? Ruth gave him the only answer she had. Sir, I watched 17 men get classified as expectant and left to die because our protocols were too slow to save them. I had read about universal donor theory, I had 83 units of O-negative blood, and I had to choose between following regulations that guaranteed those men would die or trying something that might save them. I chose to try. And if the transfusions had killed them, Patterson asked. Then I would have killed them, Ruth said, and I would have accepted responsibility for that, but at least they would have died because someone tried to save them, not because protocols said they weren't worth the effort. Patterson was quiet for a moment, then he said something that changed Ruth's life. Lieutenant Mitchell, the Army exists to win wars, but the Army Medical Corps exists to save lives. Sometimes those missions conflict, sometimes following the rules means accepting deaths that don't need to happen. What you did was reckless and unauthorized and violated every protocol we have. But it also saved 24 American soldiers who would otherwise be dead. I'm not going to court-martial you, I'm going to recommend you for a commendation, and I'm going to recommend that the Army Medical Corps immediately adopt O-negative universal donor protocols for all battlefield hospitals. Ruth was too exhausted to feel relief, too focused on the fact that her patients were alive to care about medals or recognition. She simply nodded and said thank you, sir, then went back to work because more wounded soldiers were still arriving and the hospital was still operating beyond capacity. On January 8, 1945, the Army Medical Corps issued new guidelines for battlefield blood transfusions. In cases where patients required immediate transfusion and blood typing would delay treatment beyond acceptable time limits, medical personnel were authorized to administer type O-negative blood without prior typing or cross-matching. The protocol included specific criteria for when universal donor transfusions were appropriate, required detailed documentation of all untyped transfusions, and mandated follow-up monitoring for delayed reactions. But the core principle was clear: saving lives took priority over following procedure, and O-negative universal donor blood was now officially recognized as a battlefield medical tool. Ruth Mitchell's unauthorized experiment had become official Army policy, and the implications extended far beyond one evacuation hospital in Belgium. Between January and May 1945, Army hospitals across Europe performed over 14,000 universal donor transfusions using the new protocols. Post-war medical analysis estimated that approximately 4,000 soldiers survived wounds that would have been fatal under previous blood transfusion procedures. 4,000 American lives saved because one nurse decided that protocols were less important than people. But Ruth's story didn't end with policy changes and lives saved. There were consequences she never anticipated, recognition she never received, and a legacy that remained hidden for 45 years. Ruth Mitchell continued serving with the 67th Evacuation Hospital through the end of the war in Europe. They followed Allied armies eastward through Germany, treating wounded from the final battles of the war, and finally stopped advancing when Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. She was promoted to captain in March 1945, received an official commendation for her December 1944 actions, but never received a medal because Army policy in 1945 didn't award medals to nurses for medical innovations, only for valor under fire or wounds received in combat. The commendation letter praised her quick thinking and dedication to saving lives but didn't mention that she'd violated direct orders or that her actions had fundamentally changed battlefield medicine. After the war ended, Ruth was offered a position teaching at the Army Medical School, training the next generation of military nurses in battlefield medicine and the new universal donor protocols she'd helped establish. She declined. She'd seen enough war, enough blood, enough suffering, and wanted to return to civilian life and normal nursing where following protocols didn't mean watching people die. She was discharged from the Army Nurse Corps in September 1945 with an honorable discharge and returned to Indianapolis, where she went back to work at Indianapolis City Hospital in the emergency department. She never spoke publicly about the blood transfusions, never mentioned the Battle of the Bulge, never told her colleagues or friends that she'd saved 24 lives through unauthorized medical procedures or that Army policy had changed because of what she'd done. She married in 1947, a veteran named Charles Foster who'd served in the Pacific. They had 3 children between 1948 and 1953, and Ruth balanced working part-time as an emergency room nurse with raising her family. Her children knew she'd been an Army nurse during the war but didn't know details. She'd tell them occasional stories about working in field hospitals or treating wounded soldiers but never mentioned Belgium or blood transfusions or the night she violated every regulation to save men who were dying. Ruth retired from nursing in 1978 at age 60, spent her retirement years gardening, volunteering at her church, and spending time with her 6 grandchildren. She developed breast cancer in 1987, underwent treatment, went into remission, then relapsed in 1989. She died on March 14, 1989, at age 70, surrounded by her family, and was buried at Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. Her obituary in the Indianapolis Star mentioned her nursing career and her Army service but said nothing about blood transfusions or battlefield medicine or the thousands of lives saved by protocols she'd helped establish. Her family held a small funeral, cleaned out her house, sorted through her possessions, and found boxes of letters, photographs, and documents that Ruth had never shown anyone. Among those documents was a letter dated February 1945, handwritten on U.S. Army stationery, addressed to First Lieutenant Ruth Mitchell, Army Nurse Corps. The letter was from Private Thomas Bradley, the 19-year-old from Ohio who'd been the first patient Ruth transfused with O-negative blood. The letter read, "Lieutenant Mitchell, I'm writing to thank you for saving my life. The doctors told me I was dying from blood loss and wouldn't survive without a transfusion, but they said there wasn't time to type my blood and match it with donor blood. They said I was going to die, then you came and gave me blood anyway. You told me later that you broke regulations to do it, that you weren't supposed to give blood without testing it first, but you did it anyway because I was dying and you wanted to give me a chance. I'm alive because you broke the rules. I'm going home to Ohio because you took a risk. I'm going to see my parents again because you decided I was worth saving. I don't know if I'll ever see you again after the war, but I wanted you to know that everything I do with the rest of my life, I owe to you. Thank you for my life, Private Thomas Bradley." Ruth's daughter, Susan Foster, read that letter in her mother's house in March 1989 and realized she'd never known what her mother had done during the war. She found more letters in the boxes, letters from other soldiers Ruth had treated, letters from Army medical officers, letters thanking Ruth for her service and her courage and her willingness to challenge protocols that were killing people. Susan contacted the Army Medical Department to learn more about her mother's service, was connected with military historians researching battlefield medicine in World War II, and discovered that Ruth's unauthorized blood transfusions had become a case study in medical schools. Discovered that the universal donor protocols established in January 1945 had evolved into modern emergency medicine protocols used worldwide. Discovered that type O-negative blood is now designated as universal donor blood in every hospital, blood bank, and emergency medical system globally, and that millions of lives have been saved over 75 years using the principles Ruth proved in December 1944. Susan also discovered something that shocked her. Ruth had never received formal military recognition for what she'd done, no medal, no honor, no acknowledgement beyond a commendation letter that praised her dedication without explaining what she'd actually accomplished. In 1990, Susan petitioned the Army to posthumously award her mother the Soldier's Medal, the highest honor for non-combat heroism, for saving lives through extraordinary courage and medical innovation. The petition was supported by military historians, medical officers, and veterans organizations. It documented Ruth's actions in December 1944, the lives she'd saved, the protocols she'd established, and the legacy she'd created. On November 11, 1991, Veterans Day, the Army awarded Ruth Mitchell the Soldier's Medal posthumously, making her one of the first female nurses to receive the honor. The citation read, "For exceptional courage and dedication to saving lives under combat conditions, First Lieutenant Ruth Mitchell demonstrated extraordinary heroism on December 19, 1944, when she performed unauthorized blood transfusions on critically wounded soldiers using universal donor protocols that had never been tested in battlefield conditions. Her actions directly saved 24 American lives and established medical procedures that have since saved millions of lives worldwide. Her courage and commitment to her patients exemplify the highest traditions of the Army Nurse Corps and the United States Army." Susan accepted the medal on her mother's behalf at a ceremony at the Pentagon, surrounded by her siblings, her children, and several men who'd been treated by Ruth during the war. One of those men was Thomas Bradley, now 66 years old, who'd flown from Ohio to attend the ceremony. Bradley spoke briefly, saying that Ruth Mitchell had given him 54 years of life he wouldn't have had, that he'd raised 4 children and had 7 grandchildren who existed because one nurse decided regulations were less important than lives, and that he wished he could have thanked her one more time before she died. The ceremony ended, the medal was presented, and Ruth Mitchell's story finally became part of the official record, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten, finally recognized for what it was, one of the most important medical innovations of World War II, created by a nurse who refused to watch people die when she had the knowledge and the courage to save them. The universal donor protocol that Ruth Mitchell proved in December 1944 became the foundation for modern emergency transfusion medicine, and its impact extends far beyond World War II. During the Korean War, Army medics performed over 50,000 universal donor transfusions using O-negative blood, saving an estimated 12,000 soldiers who would have died from blood loss before conventional typing and matching could be completed. During the Vietnam War, the protocol evolved further with the introduction of helicopter medical evacuation. Wounded soldiers could be transfused with O-negative blood during flight, arriving at field hospitals already stabilized instead of dying in transit. In civilian medicine, emergency rooms adopted universal donor protocols in the 1960s. Trauma patients arriving unconscious or in critical condition now routinely receive O-negative blood immediately while their blood type is being determined, saving precious minutes that often mean the difference between survival and death. Modern blood banking systems maintain dedicated reserves of O-negative blood specifically for emergency use. Blood donation organizations actively recruit O-negative donors and designate them as universal donors, and medical schools teach Ruth Mitchell's story as a case study in the importance of challenging protocols when protocols fail patients. A 2014 study by the American College of Surgeons estimated that universal donor transfusion protocols save approximately 75,000 lives per year in the United States alone, and over 1 million lives per year worldwide across military and civilian medical systems. Every person who receives O-negative blood in an emergency room, every trauma patient who survives because transfusion began immediately instead of being delayed for typing, every soldier who makes it home from war because a medic had universal donor blood available, owes their life to a protocol that began with one nurse refusing to follow regulations that would have let 24 men die. But the broader lesson of Ruth Mitchell's story isn't about blood transfusions, it's about the courage required to challenge authority when authority is wrong, about trusting your expertise even when regulations and consensus say otherwise, about recognizing that sometimes the rules designed to protect people actually kill them, and sometimes breaking those rules is the only ethical choice. Ruth understood that medical protocols existed for good reasons, that blood typing and cross-matching prevented transfusion reactions and saved lives in normal circumstances. But she also understood that battlefield conditions weren't normal circumstances, that protocols designed for controlled hospital environments didn't always work when soldiers were bleeding out in field hospitals under artillery fire. She recognized that following the rules meant accepting preventable deaths, and she wasn't willing to accept that. So she broke the rules, took personal responsibility for the consequences, and proved that her judgment was correct. That willingness to trust expertise over protocol, to accept risk in service of saving lives, to challenge systems that prioritize procedure over outcomes, that's what separated Ruth Mitchell from nurses who simply followed orders. And that's what created a medical innovation that has saved millions of lives over 75 years. The 24 soldiers Ruth transfused in December 1944 survived the war and went home to their families. They had children and grandchildren. They lived full lives that wouldn't have existed if Ruth had followed regulations. Thomas Bradley, the first patient, lived until 2006. He spent 62 years grateful to a nurse he'd met for maybe 20 minutes during the worst night of his life. In 2003, 3 years before he died, Bradley was interviewed by a military historian studying World War II medicine, and he said something that captures the essence of Ruth Mitchell's legacy. Lieutenant Mitchell saved my life by breaking the rules. She did something she wasn't supposed to do because doing what she was supposed to do meant watching me die. I don't know if that makes her a hero or a rebel or what. All I know is I'm alive because she decided I was worth the risk, and that's more than anyone else was willing to do for me that night. Ruth Mitchell never called herself a hero, never sought recognition for what she'd done, never believed that saving lives through unauthorized medical procedures deserved special acknowledgement. She believed she was doing her job, that her job was saving lives, and that regulations preventing her from saving lives were regulations that needed to be broken. That simple clarity, that focus on outcomes rather than procedure, that willingness to accept personal consequences for decisions that saved other people, that's what made her extraordinary. And that's what medical professionals, military personnel, and anyone who faces situations where rules conflict with right outcomes can learn from her story. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust your expertise, challenge the protocols that don't work, accept the risk of being wrong, and act to save lives even when authority says you shouldn't. Ruth Mitchell did that, saved 24 lives in one night, created protocols that saved millions more over the decades that followed, and never asked for recognition or reward. She just wanted those men to live, and she was willing to risk everything to give them that chance. That's heroism. That's innovation, and that's a legacy worth remembering.